Dr. Atchison here. We're still talking about Chapter 6, Depth Perception. This is our third lecture talking about dynamic monocular cues. So we've already covered ocular motor cues in the first video, static monocular cues in the second video. Now we're on to dynamic monocular cues. Again, this is information that's only coming from one retinal image, so one eye by itself, or each eye by itself. And this is information about movement. So this is dynamic cues, and we have three different kinds that we're going to discuss: motion parallax, optic flow, and deletion and accretion. So during movement, viewpoint changes result in changes in position of the object on the retina relative to each other. So when you move, the retinal image changes, and when the objects move, the retinal image changes. There's three main ones that we're going to talk about. Again, I mentioned these: motion parallax, optic flow, and deletion and accretion. And each of these really helps us determine depth and distance. So the first one we're talking about is motion parallax. The idea that at different speeds and directions in which the object appears to move in the retinal image gives us information about the distance, okay? So if you're walking through a desert, you have this brown cactus that's closer. As you walk, that retinal image is going to be the same size, but it's going to change position, and that's going to give you information about depth. Whereas the object, the green cactus that's in the back and the rock that's further away, both of those images are going to stay the exact size as well, but they're going to seem to move a lot slower, and that's going to give us information about depth. A great way to think about this is when you're in a car. So you're in a car, you're driving, and the stuff on the horizon doesn't look like it's moving very fast, but these trees that are very, very close, and these images that are very, very close seem to be moving a lot faster than the images that are farther away. So if you're ever driving by the mountains, and you see the mountains don't seem to really change position at all, that means they're very, very far away. Whereas the images that are very close up, the shrubs, the brush, the trees, these seem to be changing positions a lot faster. Again, this motion parallax is a dynamic depth cue that gives us information about speed and direction, and we're allowed to infer depth based on that. So again, objects that are close up, that have larger retinal images, that because they're close up, are going to appear to move a lot faster than images that are further away that have those smaller retinal images. And again, this only occurs when we are moving. Okay, so we perceive objects that are closer as moving faster than objects in the distance. Objects that are closer not only move faster, but they move in the direction opposite of the way we're going. So if we're walking east, their objects are going west. So they're going in the opposite direction. While objects that are farther away seem to move in the same direction as that we're moving. So again, this is that motion parallax, and this is where it gets its name, parallax, is because we have it's parallel to what we're doing, and we have this change based on depth. The next one that we're going to talk about is optic flow. This is, again, another dynamic depth cue based on movement in the retinal image. And this is where motion parallax was moving kind of side to side, optic flow is going to be moving forward or backward. And it's the change in the size of those objects based on those. So here's a great video that I want to show you kind of about this development of optic flow. Optic flow is not something that you're born with, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail kind of as the course goes on. A lot of these senses are not senses that are 100% formed when we're born. Vision, in fact, is one of the last developing senses. It's one of the most immature at birth. So we really have an opportunity with young children and with infants to really see how this perception develops when we look at it developmentally.
Put two infants with different amounts of experience crawling into a moving room. Emmett is a very new crawler. His attention is kept forward to focus his eye line and to determine whether he's picking up information out of the corner of his eyes. When the walls move, Emmett doesn't notice. Adults in his position would have the illusion that they themselves are moving, But because Emmett is such a new crawler, he hasn't learned to pay attention to the information flowing in through his peripheral vision. But at 9 months, Emmeline has had lots of experience crawling. She reacts quite strongly. Afraid of losing her balance, her body readjusts each time to maintain a sense of stability. What has made her sensitive to her peripheral vision is her active crawling experience, and that experience will allow her to have a healthy fear of heights.
So we've talked about each of these senses kind of by themselves. And as that video alluded to, they're not by themselves. So the difference in the child's motor skills and their crawling and their proprioception, which we'll talk about in chapter 12, determines some of this noticing optic flow. So the first baby didn't notice this optic flow, this change in the periphery, because he didn't have very much experience crawling. He didn't have that self-locomotion. Whereas the second child did notice that because she did have experiences with that. So again, this is how some of these perceptual things develop. And we'll talk about how these, again, aren't developing kind of in isolation. We'll continue to use this as an example to talk about how different senses really are integrated together. So optic flow is, again, a really, really important dynamic depth cue. It gives us information about motions of objects and surfaces as we move forward or backward through a scene. So again, it's that kind of that direction of going forward or backward. They were trying to create optic flow with that moving room. They were trying to have an optic flow illusion. But again, only the baby that had crawling experience really noticed that. And again, this is giving us information about movement in objects in our visual scene that's really caused by our movement. So as we walk closer to something, the visual retinal image changes. There's movement in our retinal image because we're walking closer. This is, again, related to motion parallax, but kind of opposite. So motion parallax is, again, you're moving side to side, and so that changes the movement in the retinal image, whereas motion optic flow is you are moving forward and backwards, and that's how that changes the retinal image. The object you are moving to really stays in focus. And so even in that moving room, that front wall didn't change. It was the walls on the side that changed. So it's, again, this information, the fixation point stays in focus. It may get smaller on your retinal image, bigger on your retinal image as you get closer to it. But the information on the side will appear to travel forward or travel backward depending on the direction that you're moving. The last one of these discussions of movement on the retinal image that we want to talk about is deletion and accretion. And this is the gradual disappearance and reappearance of objects that are occluded behind other objects. And again, as we talked about with those monocular depth cues, is that we can infer information about depth based on when something's occluded. Here we're going to occlude something, but there's going to be movement involved in it. And so it's kind of the combination of both that monocular cue of occlusion, of the partial occlusion, and then the monocular cue about moving. So deletion is the gradual hiding of an object as it passes behind another. So as this moves behind it, you're going to see less and less of it. So we're deleting it, the gradual hiding of it. Tells us information that this is moving behind an object. It tells us information about motion, which gives us information about depth. Whereas accretion is the opposite. It's the gradual revealing of an object as it emerges. So we'll start seeing very, very little of it, and then we'll see more. Okay, and now we see the full thing. So again, deletion is when it hides behind the object. Accretion is when it reveals itself from behind. And again, that's giving us information about depth. Okay, that ends our discussion of dynamic monocular depth cues. Thanks.